Relay Station KL9 existed in the particular category of infrastructure that civilizations depended on completely and appreciated minimally. The category that included water treatment, atmospheric processing, communication relays, and every other system whose absence would be catastrophic and whose presence was invisible. The station occupied a position in the transit corridor between the Meridian colonial system and the sovereignty's territorial boundary, maintaining the relay arrays that corridor traffic used for navigation and communication, and the station's position was as unremarkable as its function. Not at the corridor's origin, not at its destination, but in the middle, the mechanical equivalent of a rest stop on a highway that no one remembered existed until it was closed for maintenance, and the highway's traffic discovered what the rest stop's absence meant. The station was small by installation standards, a central hub with 4 extending maintenance arms, each arm housing the technical sections that the relay system's maintenance required. The architecture was functional. The aesthetic was functional. The entire station was functional in the way that infrastructure was functional, designed to perform its purpose with maximum efficiency and minimum expenditure. The design philosophy producing an environment whose visual character communicated, budget allocated to capability rather than appearance, with the clarity that budget allocation always communicated. Nate Calloway was in Maintenance Section 3, which was where he had been for the past 4 hours, and where he would be for the next 3 because Section 3's relay coupling array was exhibiting the intermittent phase drift that relay couplings exhibited when their calibration degraded below the threshold that the system's tolerances permitted. And the degradation required the recalibration that Nate was performing with the methodical, patient precision that recalibration demanded, and that the 4 hours already invested in the process had not diminished, because diminishing was not what Nate did when the work required sustained attention. He was 29. He occupied the maintenance section's working space, a conduit access corridor approximately 2 meters wide and 1.8 meters tall, lined with the system interfaces that the relay array's components presented to the maintenance space, and that Nate interfaced with through the tools, instruments, and physical manipulation that maintenance work required, with the comfortable, practiced efficiency of someone who had been working in spaces like this for 7 years, and whose body had developed the specific spatial awareness that conduit work produced. He was 6 feet tall, which was slightly too tall for the conduit's dimensions, and which produced the habitual stoop that tall maintenance techs developed when their height exceeded the architecture's clearance. He was broad, not with the sculpted musculature that fitness produced, but with the functional, load-bearing frame that years of lifting, carrying, and physically wrestling with mechanical systems built. His shoulders were wide. His arms carried the dense, practical strength that maintenance work required, and his hands, currently holding a phase calibration tool with the grip that 7 years of use had made instinctive, were the hands of a working technician. Large, capable, scarred in the small ways that physical labor produced, and calloused in the specific pattern that the tools of his trade wore into the skin that held them. His face was honest. The word was the most accurate descriptor. Features that were strong without being dramatic. A jaw that was squared by genetics and emphasized by the habit of setting it when concentrating. Brown eyes that carried the direct, focused quality of someone whose work required careful observation, and whose observation had become his default mode of engagement with the world. His hair was brown, cut short for practicality, carrying the particular disorder that working in conduits produced because conduits did not respect grooming. He was wearing the station's standard maintenance coveralls, the unadorned, durable work uniform that KL9 provided to technical personnel, and that communicated, through its complete absence of distinction, the particular anonymity that maintenance work provided. The coveralls said technician and nothing else, and the nothing else was the social position that the coverall's wearer occupied. The coupling's phase variance is still reading point 0.7 above tolerance, said the person working beside him, and the person's voice carried the specific combination of analytical precision and professional frustration that phase variance above tolerance produced in people whose job it was to bring the variance within tolerance and who had been attempting to do so for 4 hours. Vela Sorkale occupied the adjacent position in the conduit with the same practiced efficiency that Nate displayed. Her body adapted to the conduit's dimensions through the same process of spatial negotiation that working in tight spaces required. She was 5'6", shorter than Nate, taller than the conduit's comfortable working height would have preferred, and she moved in the space with the fluid, efficient motion that 3 weeks of conduit work on this station had added to whatever prior experience her training provided. She was Calithi, the deep twilight blue skin that her species' pigmentation produced visible on her face and hands, the only skin that the maintenance coveralls left exposed. Her features were sharp, defined, carrying the angular precision that Calithi facial architecture produced, and that the conduit's utilitarian lighting rendered in the stark, shadow-heavy detail that utilitarian lighting provided. Her eyes were violet, the standard Calithi coloring, bright, carrying the enhanced visual acuity that her species' perception provided, and that she deployed, in the maintenance context, as the diagnostic tool that enhanced visual acuity constituted when the diagnosis involved identifying microscopic component degradation that human visual acuity could not detect. Her hair was dark copper, pulled back in the practical arrangement that conduit work demanded, and that she maintained with the habitual, unthinking efficiency of someone whose grooming was governed by functional requirements rather than aesthetic ones. She was wearing the same standard maintenance coveralls that Nate wore, the Calithi variant, adjusted for the species' slightly different proportions, but carrying the same visual communication. Technician, maintenance, working. The coveralls were shapeless by design. The cut prioritized durability and range of motion over form, producing the visual effect of rendering everyone who wore them into the same category of person. Someone who worked with their hands, who occupied the infrastructure's mechanical spaces, who existed in the stratum where competence was the credential, and the credential was demonstrated daily through the quality of the work. Point 7 is within the drift margin, Nate said. If we adjust the secondary compensator before we run the final calibration, the compensator should absorb the residual variance. The secondary compensator's response curve is nonlinear above 0.5. If the residual variance peaks during calibration, the nonlinear response will amplify rather than absorb. Not if we preload the compensator with a bias offset that accounts for the nonlinear range. You want to bias load a compensator. I want to bias load a compensator. That is not standard procedure. Standard procedure has produced 4 hours of 0.7 variance. I'm proposing non-standard procedure that might produce compliance. Vela looked at him. The look was the look that 3 weeks of technical collaboration had developed, the assessing, direct gaze of a colleague, evaluating a proposed approach with the professional seriousness that the approach deserved, and the personal dynamic that 3 weeks of shared work had produced. The dynamic was respect. Earned, specific, built on the daily evidence of competence that working together provided, the kind of respect that technical people gave to other technical people whose work was good, and whose problem-solving was creative, and whose willingness to argue about the right approach was evidence of professional investment rather than ego. "Show me the bias calculation," she said, which was not agreement but the invitation to prove the approach. The technical person's version of "convince me" that carried more respect than agreement would have because agreement was passive, and the invitation to prove was active engagement. Nate showed her. The calculation was rough, scrawled on the conduit wall's maintenance surface with the stylus that techs carried for exactly this purpose. The mathematics of the bias offset worked out in the shorthand that 2 people who shared a technical vocabulary could read, and that anyone outside the vocabulary would have found incomprehensible. Vela studied the calculation. She found the error in the third line, a sign inversion that would have produced a bias in the wrong direction, and corrected it with her own stylus, the correction delivered with the casual precision of someone whose mathematical competence caught errors instinctively. "Your sign is wrong," she said. "My sign is wrong," Nate confirmed, looking at the correction. "Thank you." "You are welcome. Your approach is sound. Your arithmetic needs supervision." "My arithmetic has survived 29 years without supervision." "Your arithmetic has survived 29 years of not being checked by someone who catches sign inversions." The exchange was the texture of their relationship. The easy, rhythmic back and forth of two people whose communication was built on technical language and mutual respect, and whose mutual respect expressed itself through the specific mechanism of correcting each other's work. Because correction was how technical people demonstrated that they took each other seriously enough to check rather than assume. 3 weeks had built something. The something was not dramatic. It was not the sudden, intense connection that dramatic circumstances produced. It was the gradual, reliable connection that sustained proximity and shared work generated when the proximity was comfortable, and the work was engaging, and the person sharing both was someone whose company improved the experience of both. Nate and Vela worked together the way people who respected each other's competence worked together. Efficiently, with the friction that productive collaboration included, and that unproductive collaboration did not. The friction of two people whose standards were high, and whose investment in the work's quality produced the disagreements that quality required. They crawled through conduits together. The conduit work was the station's least prestigious and most essential maintenance task. The physical access to systems whose components were located in the narrow spaces that the station's architecture allocated to mechanical infrastructure, and that the station's personnel allocation, assigned to the maintenance techs, whose job descriptions included willing to spend hours in spaces that were designed for cables rather than people. The conduit work was where their working relationship had been built, because the conduit work was where the relationship's foundation, competence, reliability, the willingness to do the unglamorous work that the glamorous systems depended on, was most visible. They ate lunch together. The lunch was the social extension of the professional relationship, the 30-minute break that the maintenance rotation schedule provided, and that Nate and Vela spent in the maintenance section's break area, a small space equipped with a table, 2 chairs, and the thermal unit that heated the ration packs that the station's provisioning system provided for maintenance personnel. The ration packs were not good. The ration packs were the specific quality of food that infrastructure budget allocations produced when the allocation prioritized system maintenance over personnel satisfaction. And the quality was a shared grievance that Nate and Vela bonded over with the specific camaraderie that shared suffering produced in people whose suffering was minor enough to be funny and persistent enough to be a reliable source of humor. "This is supposed to be protein supplement," Vela said, examining the ration pack's contents with the analytical precision that she applied to everything, and that produced, when applied to food, the specific expression of someone whose analytical capability was confirming what their sensory capability had already concluded. "The texture suggests that the protein has been supplemented with something that was not protein, and that was not food. Station provisioning classifies that as textured nutrient matrix. I classify it as technically edible. Your classification is generous. My classification is survival-oriented. If I classify it as inedible, I don't eat. If I don't eat, I can't calibrate relay couplings. If I can't calibrate relay couplings, the corridor's navigation traffic loses phase coherence. Galactic commerce depends on me eating this. Galactic commerce depends on you eating something that tastes like a maintenance manual. Galactic commerce makes unreasonable demands." She laughed. The sound was not human laughter. Calithi vocal architecture produced a harmonic shift, rather than the rhythmic vocalization that human laughter was. But the function was identical, the involuntary expression of amusement that the conversation produced, and that the expression communicated with cross-species clarity. The laughter was one of the relationship-specific pleasures, the discovery that humor, the most culturally specific form of communication, translated between them, with a reliability that suggested the translation was operating at a level deeper than cultural specificity, at the level where two people found each other funny, because being found funny by the specific person, finding you funny, was inherently funnier than being found funny by anyone else. Nate split his lunch rations with her. The splitting was habitual, established in the first week when he noticed that Kalithi ration packs contained quantities that were, by his assessment, insufficient for someone performing the physical work that their maintenance section required, and that his human ration packs contained quantities that exceeded his needs, because the provisioning algorithm allocated based on species standard caloric requirements, and his caloric requirements were below the standard. The splitting was practical. The splitting was also something else, the specific act of sharing food that carried, in every culture he was aware of and in the Kalithi culture his cultural briefings had documented, significance beyond the practical, the gesture of a person who considered another person worth feeding from their own supply. Vela accepted the split rations with the casual ease that 3 weeks of the practice had established, the acceptance carrying none of the ceremonial weight that the first acceptance had carried, and all of the accumulated meaning that 21 days of repetition had built. She ate, he ate. They discussed the afternoon's work schedule with the comfortable, practical focus that lunch breaks between working partners produced. 3 weeks. The something that 3 weeks had built was reliable and comfortable, and built on a foundation of shared work and mutual respect, and the daily accumulation of moments that were small individually and significant collectively. And the significance was present in the way they worked together and ate together and talked together, and in the way that both of them occupied the shared space of their professional collaboration, with the specific quality of people who were comfortable with each other, and whose comfort was genuine, and whose genuineness was the thing that made the comfort valuable. The coolant system breach occurred at 14:23 hours, a failure in the secondary processing module's thermal management system that released chemical coolant compounds into the maintenance section's atmospheric space. The breach was not catastrophic. The quantities released were below the threshold for acute toxicity, but the station's environmental monitoring system classified the contamination as requiring decontamination protocol for all personnel in the affected area. Because the protocol's threshold was calibrated for safety rather than efficiency, and the calibration meant that contamination levels that were medically minor triggered the full protocol response. The protocol was standard. Nate had been through it 4 times in his career, the procedure that chemical contamination events triggered and that maintenance personnel accepted as an occupational reality, because working in proximity to chemical systems meant occasionally being in proximity to chemical systems when they breached. Atmospheric flushing of the affected section, personnel relocation to the decontamination facility, removal of contaminated clothing for chemical processing, personnel decontamination through the cleaning system's atmospheric scrubbing procedure. The entire protocol took approximately 40 minutes and was, by the consensus of maintenance techs who had experienced it, unpleasant, undignified, and necessary. The decontamination facility was shared use, a functional space whose design reflected the protocol's operational requirements rather than the personnel's comfort preferences. The facility contained the atmospheric scrubbing systems that the decontamination procedure used, the chemical processing units that treated contaminated clothing, and the preparation area where personnel removed the contaminated coveralls before entering the scrubbing chamber. The preparation area was communal, not because the station's designers were indifferent to privacy, but because the protocol's urgency required processing efficiency required the parallel preparation of multiple personnel, and parallel preparation required shared space. Nate and Vela entered the preparation area together because they had been working in the same section when the breach occurred, and because the protocol processed contaminated personnel in groups defined by exposure area. Two other techs from their section were processing ahead of them, already in the scrubbing chamber, their coveralls in the chemical processing unit. Nate and Vela were next. The preparation area was functional. Bright lighting, the operational illumination that decontamination facilities required for visual inspection of contamination levels on personnel and clothing. Bare surfaces, the easy clean materials that chemical processing facilities used. No privacy accommodations. The space was designed for the efficient removal of contaminated clothing and the efficient transition to the scrubbing chamber. And the efficiency did not include the delays that privacy partitions or sequential processing would have introduced. Nate unfastened his coveralls with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before, and whose relationship with the process was governed by the same practical attitude that governed his relationship with all occupational necessities. Get through it, get back to work. The coveralls came off. Underneath, he wore the standard undershirt and shorts that maintenance personnel wore beneath coveralls as the base layer that the decontamination protocol processed separately. The removal was unremarkable, a man taking off contaminated work clothes in a space designed for the taking off of contaminated work clothes. Vela unfastened her coveralls. The unfastening was the same practical, efficient motion that the protocol required. The front closure of the Calitha variant coveralls releasing, the garment separating, the person within the garment becoming visible as the garment's concealment was removed. What the garment's concealment had been concealing stopped Nate's cognitive processing. The standard maintenance coveralls were shapeless. They concealed everything below the neckline and above the wrists in the uniform, undifferentiated fabric that the coverall's functional design produced. The concealment was universal. Every person wearing the coveralls looked the same from the neck down, the coveralls converting individual bodies into the standard silhouette of maintenance technician, and erasing whatever the individual bodies beneath the silhouette contained. What Vela's body contained, beneath the coverall's standard silhouette, was bioluminescent markings, not the standard patterns. Every Calithi possessed bioluminescent displays, the chromatic patterns along the temples, the bridge of the nose, the jaw, the emotional communication system that the species biology produced and that the face displayed. Those patterns were standard. Those patterns were visible above the coverall's neckline. Those patterns were what Nate had been reading for 3 weeks as part of the communication that their working relationship used. The markings that the coverall had concealed were not standard. They were on her shoulders. They extended from her collarbones, flowing across the curve of her shoulders, down her upper arms, tracing the lines of her physiology with a precision and complexity that was immediately, visually, obviously different from the facial displays that standard Calithi biology produced. The standard facial displays were organic, shifting, responsive, the dynamic chromatic output of an emotional communication system. These markings were architectural. They were fixed, not shifting but permanent, the luminescence constant rather than responsive, the patterns carrying the intricate, deliberate design of something that was encoded rather than expressed. The patterns were beautiful. The observation was involuntary, Nate's visual processing, registering the markings' aesthetic quality before his cognitive processing, registered their significance. The luminescence was deep gold, not the common amber gold that Calithi standard coloring produced but a richer, more intense gold that carried a visual weight that the standard coloring did not. The pattern's design was geometric, precise, symmetrical, carrying the mathematical elegance that intentional design produced, and that organic variation did not. The markings covered her shoulders and upper arms in a continuous display that was, in its visual impact, stunning. The elaborate, luminous expression of something that the coverall's shapeless concealment had rendered completely invisible for 3 weeks. His cultural database activated. The database was the reference system that human personnel in joint operation postings maintained, a repository of cross-cultural identification data that enabled human workers to recognize the cultural markers, insignia, and biological indicators that allied species used for social identification. The database was designed for exactly this scenario, encountering a visual marker whose significance required cultural knowledge to interpret. The database's identification was fast. The identification was specific. The identification produced in Nate's cognitive processing the particular effect that information produced when the information fundamentally restructured the framework through which you understood a person you thought you knew. Imperial lineage markers. The bioluminescent patterns that only the Calithi imperial family's genetics could produce. The biological identification that functioned as the sovereignty's most absolute form of identity verification. Patterns that could not be replicated by any technology, could not be produced by anyone outside the imperial bloodline, and that the imperial family's genetic architecture expressed across the specific areas of the body that Vela's removed coverall was revealing. Shoulders, collarbones, upper arms. The traditional concealment areas, the regions that Calithi formal and informal clothing covered, and that the covering made the marker's presence invisible until the covering was removed. Crown Princess. The database's identification was not ambiguous. The pattern configuration, the specific geometric arrangement, the gold luminescence intensity, the coverage area matched the database's entry for first-line imperial succession. Not a cousin, not a minor royal. The heir. Nate stared. The staring was not voluntary. It was the output of a cognitive system that had received information exceeding its processing capacity, and that had suspended motor function while the processing attempted to catch up. He stared at the markings on the shoulders of the woman he had spent 3 weeks correcting wrench technique with, and splitting lunch rations with, and arguing about torque specifications with. And the staring was the specific, paralyzed expression of a man whose understanding of his own life was undergoing a revision, that the revision's magnitude made temporarily impossible to complete. Vela saw him see. The moment was visible. The moment when his eyes moved from the practical assessment of the decontamination preparation area to the bioluminescent markings that her removed coverall had revealed, and the moment when his expression changed from the casual, unremarkable attention of a colleague in a shared space to the frozen, recognition-altered attention of a person who had just identified what they were looking at, and who was processing the identification with the specific expression that identification produced when the identification restructured everything. Her response was immediate, not the composed, managed response of a royal handling a disclosure, the tense, defensive response of a person who had been through this moment before and who knew what it cost. Her body language shifted, the comfortable, open posture of a colleague in a shared space, contracting into the guarded, protected posture of a person expecting impact. Her bioluminescent facial patterns, the standard emotional displays that 3 weeks of working together had taught Nate to read with reasonable fluency, shifted from the warm copper of routine activity to the sharp, bright silver that his 3 weeks of chromatic literacy identified as the Calithi expression of acute anxiety. She expected the dynamic to shatter. The expectation was visible in every line of her body, in the silver brightness of her patterns, in the way her hands, the hands that had held tools with practiced familiarity, that had corrected his sign inversion, that had accepted his split rations, moved to cover the markings, the instinctive gesture of someone attempting to conceal the thing that the concealment had failed to contain. The covering was too late, and the covering was futile, and the futility was visible in the way her hands stopped before they reached her shoulders. The gesture abandoning itself because the gesture's purpose, returning the concealment that the coverall had provided, could not be achieved by hands that were not coveralls, and the impossibility produced the specific, devastating posture of someone whose exposure was complete and who could not reverse it. "The Vel Sarath," she said, and her voice was different, not the confident, professional voice of the engineer who argued about torque specifications, but the quiet, controlled voice of someone delivering information that they expected to change everything, and who was managing the delivery with the composure that the change's anticipated magnitude required. The immersion of understanding. It is a tradition. The imperial family, we spend years working in common professions, to understand, to learn what governance requires by learning what the governed experience. "You're the crown princess," Nate said, and the words emerged from the cognitive processing that had been working to catch up and that had caught up enough to produce the essential conclusion, though the catching up was not complete, and the incompleteness was audible in the voice's flat, stating quality. The voice of a person reporting a fact that they had identified but not yet integrated. "Yes, you're the crown princess and I've been." The integration was beginning. The integration was producing a retrospective recalculation that was applying the new information to 3 weeks of accumulated experience, and that the recalculation was generating was the specific, vertiginous quality of a person watching their memories revise themselves in real time. "I corrected your wrench technique." "Yes, I told you that your wrench grip was producing lateral torque variance and that you should adjust your wrist angle." "You did." "I told the crown princess of the Kalithi sovereignty that she was holding a wrench wrong." "You told your colleague that her wrench technique could be improved." "Your colleague happened to be—" She stopped. The stopping was the specific interruption that occurred when the sentence being constructed encountered the word that the sentence's content made painful, and the word was the word that described what she had been to him for 3 weeks and what she was afraid she could no longer be. "Your colleague." The decontamination facility's preparation area was quiet. The bright operational lighting illuminated 2 people standing in the practical space, where contaminated clothing was removed, one of them bearing the bioluminescent markers of imperial succession, and the other bearing the expression of a man whose cognitive processing was completing the integration of information that the processing had not been designed for, and that the completion was producing not the collapse that the information's magnitude might have warranted but something else, something that was forming in the space behind the shock, and that the shock was beginning to clear enough to reveal. "I split my lunch rations with you," Nate said. "Yes, I split my lunch rations with the crown princess, because I thought the Kalithi provisioning allocation was insufficient for someone doing conduit work." "The allocation is insufficient. Your assessment was correct regardless of." "I gave the heir to an interstellar empire half of my technically edible protein supplement because I thought she wasn't eating enough." "I wasn't eating enough. The ration allocation is calibrated for administrative personnel, not maintenance techs performing physical labor. Your supplementation was—" Her voice shifted. The controlled delivery was faltering, not into distress but into something else. The specific, fragile quality that a voice produced when the person speaking was trying to maintain the register that the moment seemed to require, and was finding that the register could not contain what they were feeling. "Your supplementation was the kindest thing anyone has done for me in 2 years of immersion, and it was done because you thought I was hungry, not because you thought I was royal." The sentence landed in the preparation area, with the weight that sentences carried when the sentences contained the truth that the person speaking most needed to communicate, and that the truth was simultaneously the thing they were most afraid of losing. The silence extended. The silence was Nate's processing completing its work, the cognitive architecture finishing the integration of the new information with the existing relationship, and the integration producing an output that the processing's completion allowed him to evaluate, and that the evaluation was finding, with the specific clarity that completed processing provided, to be simpler than the information's magnitude had suggested. She was the crown princess. She was also the person who had spent 3 weeks crawling through conduits with him, correcting his sign inversions, arguing about compensator theory, eating his terrible protein supplements, and working beside him with the competence and the warmth and the particular quality of presence that made the working better than it would have been without her. Both things were true. The question was which one mattered more, and the question had an answer, and the answer was the answer that the work provided, because the work did not care about bloodlines, and the work was what their relationship was built on, and the work was still there, waiting, uncompleted, indifferent to the revelation that one of the people who needed to complete it was royalty. "The reactor coolant system," Nate said. Vela blinked. The blink was the specific, involuntary response of a person who had been expecting one category of statement and who had received a different category entirely, and whose cognitive processing required the blink's brief interruption to transition between the expected and the received. "What?" "The reactor coolant calibration. We were about 40 minutes from completing it when the breach interrupted us. After decontamination, we need to go back and finish the calibration because the calibration window closes in 6 hours, and if we miss the window, the recalibration cycle resets and we lose 4 hours of work." He looked at her. He looked at her with the direct, practical, working colleague look that 3 weeks of conduit work had established, and that the revelation had not. He was discovering in real time changed. "Do you still want to finish the calibration?" She stared at him. The staring was the expression of a person receiving a response that their experience had not prepared them for, a response that existed outside the catalog of reactions that 2 years of immersion and however many identity revelations the immersion had produced had built. The catalog contained shock. The catalog contained deference. The catalog contained the awkward, formal distance that people established when they learned that the person they had been treating as an equal was not, by institutional definition, their equal. The catalog did not contain a maintenance technician asking the crown princess if she wanted to finish calibrating a reactor coolant system. "The calibration doesn't care about your bloodline," Nate said. "The couplings phase variance doesn't care. The relay array doesn't care. The conduit we've been crawling through for 3 weeks doesn't care. I'm not—" He paused. The pause was not hesitation. The pause was the precision of someone choosing words that needed to carry exactly the right weight. "I'm not going to pretend that learning you're the crown princess isn't a lot. It's a lot. It's significantly a lot. My brain is doing things that my brain does not usually do." But he looked at her. "You're also the person who caught my sign inversion. You're the person who argued with me about compensator theory for 20 minutes and was right about the nonlinear response curve. You're the person who eats my terrible protein supplements and makes jokes about maintenance manuals. Those things are also true, and those things are the things that matter in the conduit." Vela's bioluminescent pattern shifted. The sharp silver of anxiety, the color that had dominated since the moment he saw the markings, began to change. Not suddenly, not with the dramatic transformation that emotional moments in stories produced. Slowly, the way real emotional transitions occurred, the anxiety silver retreating incrementally, the warm copper of something else advancing incrementally, the chromatic display performing the honest, involuntary work of communicating what the person behind the display was feeling as the feeling shifted from the fear of loss to the tentative, fragile, hopeful recognition that the loss might not be occurring. "You want to finish the calibration," she said. "I want to finish the calibration. With me. With my colleague, who is also apparently the crown princess. Who is also apparently someone whose lunch I've been supplementing for 3 weeks, because I thought she wasn't eating enough, and who, for the record, should probably continue being someone whose lunch I supplement because the ration allocation is still insufficient regardless of bloodline, and the conduit work still requires adequate caloric intake regardless, of whether the person doing the conduit work could buy the entire station. The sound she made was the kinetic harmonic shift that functioned as laughter. The sound was different from the laughter that 3 weeks of lunch breaks had produced. The 3-week laughter was comfortable, easy, the laughter of a colleague enjoying a colleague's humor. This laughter carried something additional, a quality that the additional was producing, because the additional was relief, and relief was an emotion that changed the sounds it accompanied, making them brighter and deeper simultaneously. The sound of a person whose tension was releasing, and whose releasing was producing the specific, involuntary vocal expression of someone who had expected to lose something, and who was discovering that the something might survive. "The conduit doesn't care about my bloodline," she said. "The conduit cares about competent people maintaining the systems that the conduit houses. You are competent. The competence is the thing I noticed in the first week, and the thing I have respected for 3 weeks, and the thing that the coverall's removal has not changed, because competence is not located in the coverall. What is located in the coverall is apparently an imperial identity crisis. What is located in the coverall is a capable engineer with very impressive shoulder markings, who still needs to help me finish a reactor coolant calibration before the window closes. Impressive. I'm being clinically accurate. The markings are objectively visually impressive. This is not a political assessment. This is an aesthetic observation from someone whose aesthetic baseline is relay couplings and conduit architecture. So the bar for impressive is not high, but the markings clear it comfortably. The laughter again, warmer this time. The copper in her patterns was stronger now, the anxiety's silver retreating further, the warm copper advancing with the confidence that repeated evidence of safety provided. He was not changing. The revelation had not changed him. The man who corrected her wrench technique and split his lunch rations and argued about compensator theory was still the same man. And the sameness was the thing she had been afraid of losing, and the thing that his response was preserving, not through declaration or speech, but through the specific, practical, job-oriented behavior of a maintenance technician who had learned that his colleague was royalty, and whose response was to ask if the royalty wanted to finish the calibration, because the calibration needed finishing, and the finishing was more important than the identity of the people who finished it. "Yes," she said, "I want to finish the calibration." "Good. Decontamination first. Calibration after. Then we can have the conversation about how I've been telling the heir to an interstellar empire that she holds wrenches wrong. My wrench technique has improved. Your wrench technique has improved significantly. The Crown Princess now applies lateral torque with acceptable consistency. The empire should be proud." She was smiling. The expression was not the human smile that the word typically described. Kinetic facial architecture produced something different, a softening of the angular features that communicated the same emotional territory through different geometry. The softening was visible. The softening was, in the decontamination facility's bright operational lighting, with the imperial markers visible on her shoulders and the coverall removed, and the identity exposed. The expression of a person who had been found out, and who was finding that the finding out was not the ending she feared, but the continuation of something she valued. And the continuation was being offered by someone whose offering was not conditioned on the identity but on the work. And the work was the foundation, and the foundation was holding. They completed decontamination. They returned to the conduit. They finished the calibration. The reactor coolant system's phase variance brought within tolerance through the bias loading approach that Nate had proposed and that Vela had corrected, and that they implemented together with the same collaborative efficiency that 3 weeks had built, and that the revelation had not broken. The conduit did not care about her bloodline. The calibration did not care. The work did not care. And Nate, who cared about the revelation in the way that a person cared about information that was significant and that required processing, and that would change certain aspects of the relationship's future navigation, cared about the work more. Because the work was where they had met, and where they had built what they had built, and where the building would continue. Because what they had built was worth more than the identity that the coverall had concealed, and the work that built it was available in every conduit on the station, and the conduits did not check bloodlines at the entrance.